Hello everyone, welcome back. It's time for another Daggerheart related, Daggerheart compatible design stream. I am Mike. I was one of the additional designers on the Daggerheart core rulebook and an additional designer on Daggerheart Hope and Fear, which some folks have now had the chance to devour in PDF form thanks to pre-ordering. I did a short initial thoughts video about the campaign frames that are added in Hope and Fear, which is a Patreon paid subscriber only video that's available over at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. You can subscribe at any level and get that video, as well as a bunch of other fun stuff that's available only to paid subscribers. I will probably talk some more about Hope and Fear later on, but today we are here to talk about dark fantasy fear moves or dark fantasy GM moves. And the idea here is, one, Hope and Fear has a lot of horror and dark fantasy stuff in there between the new classes and the Dread Domain and so on. And two, the Age of Umbra Shadowlands season is underway, and that is a dark fantasy campaign. Not a hag, I can tell you that I did not design Masca Muerte in Hope and Fear, unfortunately. So your quest to find the author must continue. I honestly could not say. There's only so many people who were credited, so eventually you will find the right person. But I couldn't give you any tips, unfortunately. We have a fun notification here. Adventure Lies Ahead 1 has reached a 5-stream streak, which I think means attending the last five streams in a row. So thank you, Adventure Lies Ahead 1. Also, I don't remember if I called this out, but thank you to The Old Ways Twitch, Busquina, and X Figuring X it all out. Several extra X's in there. All folks who followed the channel 2 weeks ago when I did the stream with Matt Best from Infinite Citadel. Folks who are excited about Daggerheart campaign frames should definitely check out that stream where I talk about Bastion of Hope, as well as the 2 new campaign frames we'll be developing as part of the Hope Dies Last crowdfunding project that will be going live on GameFound later this year. You can already follow that campaign. I am going to pull up the page for it so that I can post it here and make it easier for folks to follow that page. Andrew Bowman is already ahead of me because we have ttrpg.fund/HDL as a shortcut link, which is fantastic. So you can go there for more info about Hope Dies Last and follow the campaign so you get all of the news as we share it with you all. We're going to be at Gen Con next week, though the Infinite Citadel folks have a bunch of cool things going on their own, including some mega game activity. So you should check that out, and then there'll be probably more news about Hope Dies Last following Gen Con. Many things going on. I'm still working on Drakkenheim and trying to balance several things, spin several plates, and so on and so forth. I've talked about the Patreon video. As a standard disclaimer, these videos that I do are not paid for by Darrington Press. They do not represent Darrington Press or Critical Role. I am speaking only for myself and my own perspectives and opinions on Daggerheart, how to play it, how to run it, designing for it, and things like that. We will be referring to some materials from the system reference document and utilizing the community gaming license here. You can see the text below, and we have the lovely CGL logo. Disclaimers in place, some context. I have already published a very basic pay what you want 1-page document with custom fear moves for the Witherwild campaign frame designed on a previous stream, right? This is just the most basic possible layout so that you can have a 1-pager and utilize that in your game. The Witherwild as a campaign frame is in the system reference document for Daggerheart, which means we can publish CGL material for that campaign frame. Currently, Age of Umbra is not in the SRD and is not categorized as public game content. So if it was, I might make a list that was Age of Umbra fear moves or GM moves, and it would be a little bit different because I'd be using specific material. With the way that the CGL and the SRD are now, I am making a dark fantasy list that could be used for Age of Umbra, can be used more broadly, but there's going to be a differentiation, some distinction there, just to let everybody know how this is going to work. My goal for this stream is to complete as much of this list as possible, where we are going to create example fear moves that a GM could use in a dark fantasy campaign to enhance the excitement and the danger of a dark fantasy campaign. Dark fantasy as a genre label is pretty broad. And so we're talking Dark Souls, we're talking Bloodborne, we are talking Merkborg, we're talking anybody who wants to play like Grimdark in Daggerheart. The stuff I'm giving you is probably going to be applicable. Dark fantasy is not my number one fantasy subgenre in terms of my personal taste, but it is one that I now am pretty experienced in, I'm not quite done, but being lead designer on the Daggerheart campaign guide for Dungeons of Drakkenheim, originally created by the Dungeon Dudes and seen in their long-running, amazing actual play series that I think wrapped up after 7 years earlier this year or late last year. They've now started a new actual play series called Seasons of Silence, which I really like and is a totally different vibe. That is more like pastoral fantasy, closer to the Witherwild, but also pretty comparable to something like Legend in the Mist, the role-playing game from Son of Oak. So, lots of preamble there. Diving into things, we're going to make some dark fantasy moves. For me, thematic elements of dark fantasy are, corruptibility of people, betrayal, social and cosmological decay. You can see that, like a human, I sometimes misspell things. Dark fantasy is, we can also describe it as fantasy plus horror when they are smushed together, but are in kind of balance. For me, Grimdark is fantasy plus horror, which we could describe as when the horror is in charge, because it is a world that is antipathetic or misanthropic, right? A grimdark world thinks poorly of people and usually indicates that things will come to a bad end. I'm not especially a big fan of grimdark. I'm not going to dwell on it. We're focused here on dark fantasy. For me, in dark fantasy, there is hope to survive and or win over the horror elements. Where exactly you fall and how much hope there is going to be a matter of individual taste or decisions made at the table. I'm going to try and cover kind of a spread here. I'm curious for y'all, what are some other thematic or content elements that you think are an important part of dark fantasy or that you would want to see represented or gestured toward in a list of fear moves for a GM running Daggerheart? Claudion is building a Grimdark style game. Well, there you go. Junkrabbit says phobias manifest. That's a great suggestion, right? Because Daggerheart focuses so much on hope and fear. Right? This could quite easily be our very first move. A PC's phobia manifests in illusion. They must make let's say this could be instinct, knowledge, or presence. If it is explicitly an illusion, right? An instinct reaction roll or mark a stress. Fear, PCs, phobia, manifests in real life. Introduce an element that brings this phobia to the fore and reduce the PC's hope die to a D8 until they succeed with hope or directly confront or succeed. No, yeah, they succeed with hope on a roll to contend with the phobia or until the end of the scene. Not a Hag says, I would love to see some two-folded moves where one hope is lost but another door opens. I could never make those. For me, that feels like the kind of move that you would see on a failure with hope, right? You don't get this thing, but then there is another opportunity or there's another chance. And failure with hope moves per genre is another interesting place to explore, because I think for a lot of people, the two types of results that they struggle the most with are success with fear and failure with hope. Success with hope and failure with fear, in many cases, feel closer to a traditional binary result system, right? Success with hope is a success. Failure with fear is a failure or a critical failure. And then we've got these two other results that are mixed in different ways. I really like the guidance that Derek from Knights of the Last Call gives for failure with hope, which is to make a softer move on that result, to do more setup and tension building and less follow through hard moves. I think the way that the core rulebook is written invites that difference. I don't know that it's as explicit, but it is how I have come to GM Daggerheart, and it is definitely the way I recommend people consider ruling and manifesting results that are a failure with hope. Cloudion5 asks, how many extra mechanics do you think are too much to include in a published frame? I know Motherboard has quite a bit, but I'm struggling with that question. Additionally, do you think adding a starting card or two to the frame's character creation seems reasonable? Two very good questions. I talked a bit about frame construction in that Patreon video, and then of course I have a big video that's gotten a lot of views, that is how to make and use campaign frames. I'm probably due for a new making campaign frames video that I might release alongside the Hope Dies Last campaign. Though the discussion with Matt last week had a lot of that in it, I'm thinking now a new, maybe more focused video where I have like a full rundown in my outline and then go through that. So that's definitely on my mind. To your question specifically, Cloudion, I think that if your frame has the way I might frame it, reinterpret this is, if in your layout there are more than 2 pages of custom mechanics, and that is not because you are giving examples to be exhaustive. If there's more than 2 pages or more than like 1,000-ish words of several different custom mechanics, then I might get a little bit more worried. If we look at the Daggerheart core book, which I'm not going to put on screen because my understanding of the CGL leads me to not wanting to do that. Your interpretation may be different. Sorry, that's totally fine. If we go to custom mechanics in Colossus of the Drylands, it is a lot. we go from page 317 to page, let's say, 322, and then from 322 to 327 is examples of additional colossi. So for me, that first page range is what I would compare it to for custom mechanics. So that says Colossus of the Drylands is on the more complex side. But then the rest of that pagination that we're giving, that we talked about, is additional examples. That to me doesn't add more complexity. It is lightening the load of the complexity that is there by giving examples for someone to read and interpret, to use to interpret and understand what is introduced in the custom mechanics. Now that Hope and Fear is available for people who have pre-ordered, you can also go and look at Journey to Horizon, which is the new complexity for campaign frame from Darrington directly. So in those two, you can see what are the current upper bounds of complexity that Darrington is comfortable publishing in official material. I cannot speak for Darrington in saying that that is actually the ceiling, but for me, it is the best gauge or comparison that we have available in terms of what does Darrington believe is appropriate for Daggerheart. It could be that in the future, a complexity 5 campaign frame will come out from Darrington and we'll see a higher upper bound. I have no special knowledge on this that I can talk to you about. I think we should look at 4 right now as the maximum of what Darrington talks about in being complexity. Okay. Claudion's other question: do you think adding a starting card or two to the frame's character creation seems reasonable? I think adding more than one new card at character creation raises my eyebrow in like a yellow flag kind of way, especially if each new card is chosen from several options, because then you're adding several stages of decision making. For Bastion of Hope, I add the Divine Boon cards, which is a choice of 5, one of 5, but that is done explicitly after character creation. When the characters hit level 2 and tier 2, the GM is instructed to discuss with the players what heroic virtue they, the player, think Chore the goddess sees in their character, and then they get the heroic boon that goes with that virtue. Doing it this way allowed me to defer some of that complexity in terms of making session 0 longer and more involved. I got to push it back by a few sessions so that you didn't have to do it in the same session when you were picking ancestry, community, subclass, class, domain cards, and so on. Especially if people are also choosing transformations at character creation, because that's another additional step. Again, this is just my perspective. Okay, we've got some more chat here. I don't want to get too sidetracked into talking about campaign frames. So, Junkrabbit, I may have to hold off on your question. You are welcome to either post it on the YouTube for this video when that is done, or go over to Patreon and post it on something related to a campaign frame, or just whatever post you can find. And I will try to keep that in mind for future discussions about campaign frames. Deciding complexity is definitely something worth talking through more. Okay. Claudion, that idea seems promising, but I would definitely have the homebrew kit on hand and keep the guidance there about managing cognitive load and streamlining in mind when you're doing your design work. Jaybird Things says this could just be betrayal, but a trusted ally acts against the party. Maybe a lower cost for the ally is pressured by an enemy, and a higher cost for the ally is actually a scumbag and just did this on their own. Fantastic line of inquiry or line of design there, Jaybird Things. We are in accord about how that might approach. So one fear, a neutral NPC acts against the interests of the party for an additional. So there's a few different ways of doing this, right? I could say if you spend 2 fear instead, a friendly NPC acts against the interests of the party. If you spend 3 fear instead, something, right? They've always been terrible. With these fear move lists, I am still torn on whether I would like to have a smaller number of listings with variable costs or a larger number of listings where the individual permutations are broken out into separate moves. I like a cursed object, so I'm going to do some stuff with that. 2 fear. Checking all of our text here. Junkrabbit, the cursed object idea is very good. I'm going to try and unpack that. I have not played my wife played Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and I watched a little bit of it, so I don't know the reference there to the cursed shrines. Abnormal desires or dark thirst, I have sketched into a 2 fear move. Jaybird Things says, I tend to lead toward permutations getting their own listing just to have that menu GMs can reference on the fly. Quote, I have 5 fear, what can I throw at these guys? I think that there's a strong argument for that. The trick for me is, if I'm sticking with my presentation of 1 page, is it going to end up taking up more space if I do it this other way? This is not necessarily the final presentation of these moves, so I'm not going to stress it too much. Is hello, Mick. Scary Mushroom says, a related fear move could be revealing that an NPC they thought was a trusted ally was actually someone else in disguise. 100%. I would say that this absolutely should not be limited to dark fantasy, but it's definitely a kind of thing you would see in dark fantasy. And I think that this is 2 fear. Reveal that an NPC in the scene is actually an antagonist in disguise. Junkrabbit asks, here's another counting question. How do you decide the fear cost of the moves? For me, the scaling on fear costs is how big of a swing is this? How much am I changing the fiction in terms of the magnitude of its impact on the storytelling that we are doing? There's a degree to which this is vibes based, in that Daggerheart is a somewhat subjective game in a number of ways. We have the most example of fear moves that cost 1 fear. Those are the most common in Daggerheart Core, and I believe it's still the most common in Hope and Fear, though I've not done an exhaustive read of adversaries and environments from Hope and Fear. I jumped straight to the campaign frames because I was excited about them. I'm working on new campaign frames, or am crowdfunding new campaign frames soon, so that's kind of where my greatest interest led me upon getting access to the PDF. If we look at the fear moves for the Witherwild campaign frame that I did, for 1 fear, you could reveal that an NPC has contracted the Serpent Sickness. For 2 fear, turn a creature with Serpent Sickness into stone as the disease runs its course. Right? So if you already have Serpent Sickness, 2 fear, so it's more fear to basically kill them, but some amount of fiction is required ahead of time, right? They have to already have the Serpent Sickness. I probably wouldn't spend 1 fear to give an NPC the Serpent Sickness and then 2 fear to immediately have them die. I would be more likely to spend 3 fear and reveal that an NPC has already had Serpent Sickness and is close to death. I probably wouldn't go all the way to reveal an NPC that nobody knew had Serpent Sickness, has Serpent Sickness, and dies all in 1 move. I might have a random person in a scene die to Serpent Sickness in 1 move because they were not previously very important to the story. But the more important a character is to the story, the bigger a change to the fiction it is to remove them from the fiction or to do something big to them. Right? If I wanted to give the Fane Wraith Serpent Sickness in a Witherwild campaign, that can be a big deal, but that also depends on how much of an impact and the scale of the role the Fane Wraith plays on this campaign. They might be important in the setting more broadly, but not very important to our campaign yet. If that was the case, they're pretty important in the setting, but not that important to our campaign. So I might take a higher fear cost based on how important they are, and then reduce it because they've not been important to our game. But that first move I do with regards to the Fane Wraith would probably be, I reveal that the Fane Wraith has Serpent Sickness. And then I'm going to get some drama out of that before I would escalate to have the Fane Wraith consumed by the Serpent Sickness. For me, a higher fear cost move is the kind of move, or I would spend a higher cost in fear when I am making a move that feels more like I am putting my thumb on the scale of the campaign. The highest cost fear move that I have on my Witherwild list is 6 fear. A faint divinity is corrupted by the Witherwild, becoming an extreme version of themselves. Their warped power unbalances their area of influence to disastrous results. That is 6 fear to have all of that happen. It would be less fear to say a faint divinity begins showing corruption from the Witherwild. Right? That might be 2 or 3 fear. And then, depending on how I manifest that infection, I might introduce a countdown toward that corruption overcoming or overtaking the divinity, or I might let the fiction progress, and then later on spend fear to accelerate that. In a Witherwild game I ran, I think I spent 2 or 3 fear and introduced a countdown that said, in 6 or 8 long rests, a faint divinity is corrupted by the Witherwild. And I just put it on the table for the players to know without their characters necessarily knowing what was happening. And then I started introducing fiction to signal it to them as that countdown was progressing. This is very much in line with the guidance on long-term countdowns that you can see in the core rulebook in the GM section. Jaybird Thing says, God, I love countdowns like that. One of my big GM tips for Daggerheart or any game is put big countdowns or big swing clocks on the table and tell the players, right? Make it visible to the players and basically stare them in the eyes being like, uh-oh, that seems bad. And then see what they're going to do about it. Going back here through the discussion. I'm so glad that y'all are enjoying this topic and have lots of questions and topics and are chatting with each other and all that kind of stuff. I'm trying to keep up with everyone as I can. We have made a few GM moves here. We've made a few fear moves. We may not fill the list, but I think this discussion is great. Jaybird Thing says, reveal a friendly NPC is doomed in some way. Great idea. I think that also feels like 2 fear. Maybe it's 3 fear. Reveal that a friendly NPC has contracted a curse or discovered a doomed fate. So this would be, or learned of their imminent doom. You could absolutely tweak this move to telling the players that that an NPC is doomed without that character knowing it. The question then becomes, how do the player characters learn about the doom? Which can be a little trickier in the same way that kind of big swing countdown can be trickier. Not a Hag says, if I understand you correctly, an antagonistic NPC accuses the PCs of a crime is 1 fear, but, quote, they make the community believe their accusations is 2 fear, and, quote, the community decides to banish the NPCs because this accusation is 3 fear. But it is 1 fear each if they happen one after another over a longer period of time because the narrative moves slowly and logically in this way. That's pretty close to my thinking. There is an RPG called the Matrix RPG, not the Wachowski sisters. Sorry, I'm trying to find a game that may not be widely published right now. And where is this? I'm trying to find some kind of reference to Matrix RPGs. Okay, great. This hopefully this leads to the actual thing and is not like going to send you to malware. Chris Engel is a game designer who I met and worked with while living in Bloomington, Indiana. The Matrix RPG is a game system that lets you make arguments to add to the fiction and then with other players, adjudicate how likely that change is to happen based on what is known about the fiction, and then you roll dice to decide whether the argument made by a given player becomes true, and that new detail or new event is added to the fiction. In a Matrix RPG, I wanted to have the player characters or have a group banished from a town, and I said the group is banished from the town because they've been accused of a crime, would probably be adjudicated as less likely to happen or a less strong argument than if I started with somebody who doesn't like this group accuses them of a crime. And then next turn, I say the community comes to believe in these accusations. And then on my third turn says the community tries to banish the players. If I succeed making each of those arguments on successive turns, it is likely that the difficulty of those rolls is going to be low at each stage. The more I try to get done in one argument, the more likely that is to be adjudicated or evaluated as a weaker argument. And so I absolutely have Matrix game design in my brain when I think about scaling fear moves. I actually ran some Matrix games at Gen Con when I was in when I was in undergrad. GMing Matrix games is also a really great mental exercise, both in finding consensus and in evaluating the magnitude of proposed changes to a fiction in a game. Eventualize Ahead says, I have world countdowns in my campaigns, a long rest one that is just the world shifts in a couple of places, then an extended rest or 3 completions of the shorter one that is a major event happening, usually near them. First big one is about to go off with my Age of Umber group. Ooh, I'm excited. I second your devil face emoji, Eventualize Ahead. That is related to Scary Mushroom's note, thinking of a way to generalize a fear move that is extinguish a sacred pyre. Something like spend 4 fear to make an area that was previously a sanctuary no longer protected from the dangers outside. Now, Scary Mushroom, I'd probably give that a 3 fear cost and word it something like a community's magical protection fails unexpectedly. Unexpectedly makes it cost more. Because if I could have a fear 1 move that says a community's magical protections show signs of weakness or show signs of strain, right? 1 monster gets past the barrier is a fear 1 move for me. Fear 2, like a 2 fear move might be a community's magical protection shows imminent collapse or will imminently fail. And then, right, there's probably a countdown for that. But 3 would be, it just goes. And you might scale that depending on what else is happening in the fiction. Jaybird Things has a great way of framing this. I like this. Gotta pay a toll to skip the long-term countdown. Right, because if you spent 1 fear and introduced a long-term countdown 4, you could then spend 4 more fear to just end that countdown, though I generally wouldn't recommend spending more than a couple of fear at a time on 1 countdown. To me, it's not a 1-to-1 cost of I spent 1 fear to introduce the countdown and then 4 more to end it. So why would it shouldn't be 5 fear because I could just spend 3 fear to do it. If you start the countdown, for me, that's a little bit of a commitment to using the time scale of that countdown. And so there should be a surcharge if you change your mind to escalate, having already set expectations for the party. Again, this becomes a judgment call, rulings over rules. I should probably do a stream about Matrix games. I wonder if I have a way of contacting Chris. No promises, but that could be fun. I certainly am in contact with a friend who is also a big proponent of Matrix games. So that's another option. Venture Lies Ahead says, or just off the top of my head, not relevant to my campaign at all, wink. Oh wait, no, I brought the wink, sorry. Something like a lighthouse on the Age of Umbra map that has helped weaken the Umbra, where the light touches that, then going out, then being relit with a dark red or purple hue. Okay, so like an inverse pyre, like an umbral pyre. That sounds pretty sick. I dig it. Right, right, something like having a whole community that is vulnerable fall to a supernatural attack. We're probably in 3 to 4 fear range, right? If the community was not vulnerable, it'd probably be 6 or more, right? If I just said, oh yeah, that town that had a sacred pyre wiped off the map. That's a huge swing. I would not feel comfortable doing that in most cases without spending a lot of fear. But if I spent a couple of fear to say that some bad thing had managed to find its way into the protections of this town, and then later use this 4 fear move to have it fall all at once, that's better to me. Another way of thinking about fear move scaling is if you are doing multiple moves, earlier moves become setup for the later moves. In Powered by the Apocalypse games, there's the concept of soft move and harder move, or soft move and hard move, and Daggerheart talks about this some. If I do a contamination enters the sacred pyre of this settlement, that's a pretty hard move, but it is also set up for another hard move later on. If you have the fictional context that supports a bigger move that you're making, right, then that becomes cheaper in terms of fear cost to me. A salute to Not a Hag for contributing to the cult's totem. I did the drink earlier there, but I didn't want to let it go unnoticed. Jaybird Thing says, Hellpire! I dig it. That's the contaminated sacred pyre. I am behind on Sallow Lands, so I'm not privy to all the stuff that's gone on. Yeah, cursed branch that makes cursed pyres that attracts the Umbra instead of repelling it. 100%. Right? Because that could even be our cursed object up here. While bound, the PC's hope die is reduced to a D10. A PC can clear bound and get rid of the object, and they cannot give away the object. By completing a progress countdown 4 in a settlement or location by using rare magical materials. So on this cursed object move, right? This is a lot for 1 fear, But introduce a cursed object is not the PC picks up a cursed object. There's a little bit of nuance and trickiness here to figure out, because if I spend a fear and I say, I introduce a cursed object somewhere in the room, that signals to the players they need to be careful. Some players will embrace the danger and be like, oh, I'm going to go see if I can find the cursed object, because they want scary things to happen to their characters, right? They take the chew toy approach to role-playing, where they treat the character as a chew toy. Not everybody does that. A player character gets a reaction roll, so they might just not deal with it. Maybe I want to change that, maybe I don't. If they get the condition, they have a penalty. It's not huge, but it is notable. Hope die going from a D12 to a D10 is on average a -1 to every roll. They can get rid of it by completing a progress countdown, but to do that, they need to be in a settlement and have rare magical materials worth at least 2 bags of gold. This is a lot of text. We've reached the point where this is kind of almost an environment move on its own, or like a cursed object as adversary. We'll see. Also, to your point, Claudion, tone to me impacts expected costs for GM moves. For me, I would ask myself to spend more fear to introduce a cursed object in a Witherwild campaign or a Castle High campaign than I would in an Age of Umbra campaign or a Drakkenheim campaign. Because the tonal expectations of Drakkenheim and Age of Umbra are more toward the world is bad and has bad things in it. I would probably feel bad about spending only 4 or 5 fear to have a vulnerable community fall to attacks by supernatural forces all at once in the Witherwild, Castle High, or maybe even 5 Banners Burning. So there is a good deal of subjectivity here and relativity based on other elements in your campaign, right? What fiction is established? What tone is the campaign frame designed for? What are the tonal goals and palette for your game? Even beyond that, you may disagree with me on what something should cost, and I would encourage everyone to follow their own gut and their own judgment when doing things like this in your game. I will often also tell my players why I think something costs the amount of fear that it does, to show that I am acting in as much good faith as I can. Claudion asks, I think I have a hard time feeling okay spending fear to do big and abrupt things. At what point does a spearfend just become an initiating event for plot? When you are GMing, you can still make moves that aren't fear moves. If I were making a non-fear move, even on a failure with fear, I would generally not feel comfortable doing something that feels like it's more than 1 or 2 steps at once. A failure with fear might lead to a consequence that says, it turns out that in this treasure hoard you found, there's a cursed object. On a failure with fear, I might feel comfortable saying, you realize that as you pick up the sword. And then I might ask for the presence reaction roll, because that is a failure with fear. I'm invited to make a pretty hard move. But in one move, I am generally not trying to skip ahead several steps of narrative beats, right? I'm not speed running through several narrative beats. I'm advancing the story with one big or impactful beat. Again, this becomes subjective. Spending fear versus not spending fear for me has a few different dimensions. If I feel like the fiction has not already justified a move to be the next logical move to happen in its own arc, I'm probably going to want to spend fear. If I'm taking the next logical step toward consequence using the fiction that exists, I may feel comfortable not spending a fear. But again, it depends on what I'm doing. Okay, so let's go back to some of our moves. We already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 9 moves, and we're going to go back to abnormal desires. So the abnormal desires thing can be tricky because for me, I want to very strongly respect the player's agency. So if I say you get an uncanny hankering for human flesh or humanoid flesh, that is telling the player what the character is feeling. If it is the result of a supernatural influence, that's different than I am just telling you how your character is feeling. Because what I'm saying is you are under the effect of an outside force. What I might do is say something in the world is acting on you and kind of planting an intrusive, abnormal desire in your character. What do you think it is? I'm setting the terms, but I am letting the player define the details. So I might do something like this. Tell a player that their character suddenly has an intrusive thought linked to an abnormal desire. Ask them to describe it. If they act on that desire, they clear 2 stress, but lose a hope. And for me, that stress is because they've satisfied this indulgence, but they might be disgusted by themselves, expressed by losing a hope. Because with that, if I say, if you act on this, you're going to clear stress but lose hope, I'm setting expectations for my player, and I am conveying some of the theme that I'm trying to get across, right? Is this idea that you are torn between a compulsion and revulsion, right? That you might do something that your character might do something that they feel is against their self-concept, but they are driven by this compulsion. All right. Thanks for hanging out and for your great comments of Virtualize Ahead. Happy playtesting. right? So for dark fantasy, like the biggest scale move would be something like a great evil that was bound and confined breaks their chains and walks free. That's basically a big bad shows up or a big bad enters play, which is a huge move, right? This is what are my comparisons? Right, this would be like, oh, it turns out that God King Athedius did this heresy because something 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 terrible gods, and that Athedius was keeping evil gods at bay. If none of this fiction is established, this might still be 6 fear. If I start to lay the groundwork, it might not cost as much fear to have this evil break free. The more that was established ahead of time, the lower this cost, right? This 6 fear, to me, is my close analog to the 6 fear cost move in the Witherwild frame, that is, a faint divinity is corrupted by the Witherwild, right? A major player or a being that would have a major impact on the setting moves toward being an antagonist. All right, so I'm going to keep that phrasing. Moves toward being an antagonist, right? Great divinity gets corrupted, or faint divinity gets corrupted. Over in dark fantasy, great evil, already bad, but they were not in play. Big evil is now in play and an applicable threat, is a similarly big move. Jaybird Things asks, generally speaking, do you find 6 fear to be a useful cap to set fear moves at? When I've been doing this, I have kind of capped out at 6 fear. But this is a space I have been exploring in a few different ways. So you might find that there's some other instances. As I think more deeply, if you have access to the Dungeons of Drakkenheim Daggerheart playtest materials, you will see a fear move that costs 8 fear. And you may have even seen another fear move that costs more. But the Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign also has rules and instructions for raising the fear cap in that campaign. So half of your total fear cap, that number goes up if your fear cap goes up. I might lean toward or kind of settle on a rule, something along the lines of don't make moves that spend more than half of your fear cap, or don't spend more than half of your fear cap on one move at once, because that might be too big of an impact. But I don't know that I want to settle on that. It is neat, and that is appealing. In Daggerheart Core, it's a number that's in 6s, right? Because the fear cap is 12, which is 2 6s. 6 is an important number in Daggerheart. There's 6 traits. Characters start with 6 stress. You can get up to a 6 proficiency. So that may be a guideline that I have been using implicitly or subconsciously. I don't know that I necessarily want to make it a hard rule. But the bigger a move you make all at once, the more abrupt it's probably going to feel. And so there's some question about the scale of move that's so big, the players feel like the fiction is being rent apart, or that too much is happening all at once. If we look in Core at the Divine Usurpation environment, one of my favorites, an environment I have actually iterated on in Atlas of Adventure, my environments book. Right, I kind of thought about what happens in that one and then did other environment stuff that's not quite the same, but is sort of parallel. Divine Usurpation has an action feature called Godslayer. If the Divine Siege countdown has triggered, you can spend 3 fear to describe the usurper slaying one of the gods of the Hallows above, feasting upon their power, and growing stronger. The usurper clears 2 HP, increase their difficulty, damage, attack modifier, or give them a new feature from the slain god. That's pretty big, but this is after the usurper has completed multiple countdowns, and we have reached the status quo of this usurper is sieging the heavens. When they use Godslayer, they have succeeded in breaking down basically the door to the Hallows above. And then it's 3 fear to, having done all of that, kill a god and take their power. That's only 3 more fear, but it's 3 fear spent after a lot of things, or when a great deal of fiction has accumulated toward badness. And I think 3 fear is the highest cost that we see in the core rulebook for an individual move. I may be misremembering, but I'm pretty confident. I haven't reviewed Hope and Fear extensively, so I don't know whether there are other fear moves that are bigger than that in Hope and Fear. It'd be interesting to see. We're a little bit past an hour, so I think I'm going to wrap there. I'm going to scroll down again to give people the chance to take a look at some of these bigger moves. We made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 fear moves. That's pretty good. Pretty close to what I was hoping for. So I'm very happy with that. Thank you all for your great comments and questions. This would have been much harder without your contributions, so I'm very grateful there. I appreciate the suggestions and hope you like the ways that I implemented or iterated on them. Thank you to Scary Mushrooms, Jaybird Things, Cloudy on 5, Adventure Lies Ahead 1. Keep scrolling. Junk Rabbit. Not a Hag. Revealing Too Much. Mick Too Much. Checking for other people. Enesman. Andrew Bowman. Woe Alessia. And Ringtail. I think that's everybody who has been in chat and talked in chat this stream. Thanks to everyone who was lurking. Lurkers are very important. And thank you to folks who watch the VODs later on Twitch or on YouTube. If you have more questions about topics from this conversation, the best place to post them is as comments on the YouTube, which the YouTube will go live tomorrow morning. And then as a reminder, if you are a paid subscriber over on Patreon at patreon.com/MichaelRUnderwood, over here, you can watch the other video I made today on the Daggerheart Hope and Fear campaign frames, sharing my initial thoughts after reading through each of them once. And then this fall, I've got the Hope Dies Last campaign, which you can follow at, I think it's ttrpg.link/HDL. Let's find out whether that's true. Nope. It must be ttrpglink.games. ttrpg.fund. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to post this back into the chat so that the real link is there. ttrpg.fund/HDL. HDL for clarity there. And that's going to be all. Thank you again to everybody, and we'll see you next time. I may not have a video next week because I will be at Gen Con. I might record something ahead of time, but I might be too busy packing and trying to schedule things. So my apologies if there is not a stream next week. I will certainly have things to say and lots to talk about after Gen Con. But until then, I hope everyone takes care and is well, and I will see you next time.